Senator Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Lundy, welcome. I don't know if you know this, but I am a proud Coastie family member. My brother served on the Rush, where he was also part of some of the boarding patrols because he spoke Indonesian. I've been troubled, Admiral, that under the Trump administration, the DOD continues to aggressively encroach on one of the Coast Guard's core missions, maritime law enforcement. And as often happens when experienced experts are replaced with interlopers, Secretary Hegseth has arrogantly tossed aside proven tactics that the Coast Guard has employed for years to thwart drug runners, bring them to justice, and facilitate vital intelligence collection. Instead, he has been playing judge, jury, and executioner, ordering military strikes to summarily kill suspected drug runners without regard for the laws of armed conflict or any evidence that these small vessels pose immediate imminent threat to the United States. Admiral Lundy, can you explain why the Coast Guard's trained boarding teams shoot at the engines instead of the operator when pursuing a suspected drug smuggling vessel?
Senator, when we conduct our maritime law enforcement operations at sea under our DHS and Coast Guard authority, we are interdicting those vessels as a law enforcement operation to seek to not only stop the drugs, but potentially prosecute those that are aboard. And so part of stopping those vessels that are smuggling drugs is our very specialized capability to disable them from a helicopter, our helicopter interdiction squadron that works with a cutter and small boat and our highly specialized teams to do those operations under our law enforcement authority.
Would you agree that the intelligence gathering component of it is also an important part of what you do when you stop these vessels?
When we conduct our law enforcement operations, it is, Senator.
Thank you. I agree that the use of lethal force against individuals and vessels suspected to be trafficking drugs, an action that by itself does not constitute armed conflict or terrorist activity, is illegal under the United States and international law. The Trump administration has heavily implied that fentanyl overdose deaths justify the unauthorized use of military force against small vessels departing Venezuela. Admiral Lundy, the U.S. Coast Guard has significant experience combating drug trafficking organizations. Does the U.S. Coast Guard have any reason to suspect that Venezuela is a major manufacturing hub for fentanyl?
Senator, our principal interdictions that involve Venezuela or Venezuelan gangs, and we've seen that principally in the Caribbean, that's principally we see the movement of cocaine at sea, but our criminal investigations that have been conducted in accordance with, along with Department of Justice, show strong ties between some of these groups that move the cocaine and other groups that are producing fentanyl. So we see the interdiction of cocaine, that's a cash crop for many of these cartels that funds their ability to produce and move fentanyl.
But you're not seizing massive amounts of fentanyl when you're doing these interdictions with vehicles that are leaving Venezuela?
Well, in my experience, Senator, the fentanyl we see, given its size and how it's moved, is traditionally moved by other means, not in bulk amounts like cocaine at sea.
Yeah, I think that's a clear point that most of the cocaine that passes through Venezuela to the United States arrives by air, and that sea routes departing Venezuela are mostly headed to Europe. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, Senator, your question was about cocaine to Europe?
Well, yes. So my understanding is that cocaine is a major illegal narcotic we agree that cocaine is the major narcotic that is transiting through Venezuela, and that most of it that's coming through Venezuela arrives in Venezuela by air. Is that correct?
I'd have to go back and look at how it gets into Venezuela, Senator, but when we see it move out of Venezuela through the Caribbean toward Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and other parts of the U.S., we see that move by sea, cocaine move by sea.
Okay. And just to be precise, last year, roughly how many pounds of fentanyl did the U.S. Coast Guard interdict that was arriving from Venezuela to the United States by sea?
I'm not aware of interdictions of any fentanyl by sea. The cocaine is the principal commodity or drug that's moved by sea.
Thank you. Aware of any in the last 5 years?
I'm not aware of any from Venezuela that we have seized as the Coast Guard in the last 5 years, Senator.
Thank you. Are a majority of individuals that the Coast Guard apprehends when it interdicts a vessel running drugs into the United States senior cartel leaders or important DTO members? Or often, do you find cartels hire individuals who know how to operate a vessel and are desperate for a job to operate those vessels?
Well, Senator, in our experience, the people that operate the drug smuggling vessels that we interdict in our maritime law enforcement role are connected with the cartels. They're part of the broader network.
But they're not the leaders of the cartel.
Not in my experience, they're not the leaders of the cartels.
Thank you. That's what I thought. The intelligence community and drug enforcement agencies in this country have known that the PRC is the true source of fentanyl precursor chemicals, which are bought by customers in Mexico and then smuggled into the United States. Bottom line, beyond alarm over the legality of these boat strikes, I fear that our country has grown distracted from the true threat vectors, whether it's fentanyl arriving from Mexico or countering the PRC in the Indo-Pacific region, particularly Southeast Asia. The Indo-Pacific theater poses a unique challenge in effectively countering the PRC and building robust and stable relationships with partners and allies requires a stable presence and predictable investments, especially in the Indo-Pacific. The last thing the Coast Guard should be forced to do is reroute resources and assets away from the Indo-Pacific to support President Trump's reckless foreign campaign to run Venezuela and enrich big oil corporations. Admiral, how has a pivot to Southcom operations impacted the Coast Guard's ability to reassure partner nations that the Coast Guard is committed to countering the PRC's role in maritime disputes, especially in the South China Sea?
Senator, we continue to maintain a trajectory of growth of Coast Guard posture in the Indo-Pacific with the addition of more cutters and more personnel, including in the pending 26 budget that will place additional personnel and capability in the Indo-Pacific. So the Coast Guard is not diminishing our footprint and presence in the Indo-Pacific, because for us, that's part of the U.S. homeland too, with Hawaii and the 3 territories there.
Absolutely. Well, I hope that continues to be true, but it is imperative that if the Coast Guard is forced to maneuver assets in a manner that jeopardizes its ability to fulfill statutory obligations, that you as Commandant report that deficiency to Congress immediately. So will you report back to Congress should your ability to maintain the commitments in the Indo-Pacific start to degrade?
Yes, Senator, I will.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being here.
Senator Tammy Duckworth sharply questioned senior Coast Guard leadership during a congressional hearing, raising serious concerns about the Trump administration's approach to maritime drug enforcement and U.S. security priorities. Opening her remarks, Duckworth said she speaks from personal experience as a Coast Guard family member. She noted that her brother served aboard a Coast Guard cutter and participated in boarding patrols, giving her deep respect for the service's law enforcement mission. The senator criticized the Department of Defense for what she described as aggressive encroachment into the Coast Guard's core responsibility of maritime law enforcement. She accused Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth of abandoning long-standing Coast Guard tactics in favor of military strikes against suspected drug-smuggling vessels. Duckworth warned that these strikes effectively turn military leaders into judge, jury, and executioner, authorizing lethal force without evidence that the vessels pose an imminent threat to the United States and without regard for the laws of armed conflict. She asked Vice Admiral Lundy why Coast Guard boarding teams disable suspect vessels by targeting engines rather than operators. Lundy explained that Coast Guard interdictions are conducted as law enforcement operations, aimed at stopping drug shipments while preserving the ability to prosecute those involved and collect intelligence. He emphasized the Coast Guard's specialized helicopter interdiction teams and coordinated operations conducted under Department of Homeland Security authority. Duckworth stressed that intelligence collection is a critical part of these missions and warned that killing suspects eliminates valuable intelligence and undermines legal accountability. The senator then challenged the administration's claim that fentanyl overdose deaths justify military force against vessels departing Venezuela. She asked whether the Coast Guard has evidence that Venezuela is a major manufacturing hub for fentanyl. Admiral Lundy responded that Coast Guard interdictions involving Venezuela primarily involve cocaine trafficking in the Caribbean. He said investigations show financial links between cocaine traffickers and fentanyl-producing organizations, but acknowledged that fentanyl itself is not typically transported in bulk by sea. Duckworth pressed further, asking how much fentanyl the Coast Guard has seized from vessels departing Venezuela. Lundy stated he was not aware of any fentanyl interdictions from Venezuela by sea, either in the past year or over the last 5 years. She also questioned who typically operates drug-smuggling vessels. Lundy confirmed that while the operators are connected to cartels, they are usually not senior leaders but lower-level individuals hired to run boats. Duckworth concluded that U.S. intelligence agencies have long identified China as the primary source of fentanyl precursor chemicals, which are processed in Mexico before entering the United States. She warned that focusing military force on Venezuelan vessels distracts from the real threat vectors. The senator also raised concerns about U.S. strategic priorities, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. She warned that diverting Coast Guard resources to South America risks weakening America's ability to counter China's growing influence in the region, including maritime disputes in the South China Sea. Admiral Lundy responded that the Coast Guard is expanding its Indo-Pacific presence, with additional cutters, personnel, and investments planned, and emphasized that the region remains a homeland priority due to U.S. territories and Hawaii. Duckworth welcomed that commitment but issued a clear warning. She said that if the Coast Guard is forced to shift resources in ways that jeopardize its legal obligations in the Indo-Pacific, Congress must be notified immediately. Admiral Lundy pledged to report any such degradation in capability to Congress. The hearing concluded with Duckworth thanking the Admiral for his testimony and reiterating the importance of lawful enforcement, strategic focus, and accountability.